Okay, last video of the week. I decided rather than trying to do an entire video just on the New World, that's just too broad, not really feasible. So I'm just going to focus in this video on one facet of the European colonization of the New World, which is um, religion. And it's true that some of the original explorers and conquistadors coming from Europe, some of them were not terribly interested in religion, at least not terribly interested in converting the native people. But of course, not much time goes by at all before a lot of people in Europe realize that this is an unprecedented sort of missions opportunity. You're going to read about one of these famous early missionaries, Bartolome de las Casas, Lascasas. Of course, Las Casas is a good example not just of a missionary, but of a European missionary who found himself at odds with some of his fellow countrymen who were really exploiting the native workforce. And Las Casas spoke out against it and got his writings banned by the Spanish crown for the effort. So there's going to be, in some cases, real tension between the colonizers and the missionaries, even though they might be of the same nationality. Now, of course, to go ahead and kind of skip to the end of the story, the missionaries are incredibly successful, at least in terms of sheer number of converts. Now, of course, this success has a lot to do with the European missionaries themselves. Many of them were either Dominican friars or Jesuits. But you're going to read about a couple of instances in which native people, Native Americans themselves, had a major role in the propagation of Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism. So you're going to read about the Mexican peasant Juan Diego, who in 1531 had experienced a vision of Mary while he was in the region of Guadalupe. And this is the beginning of the incredibly popular Mexican tradition of the Virgin of Guadalupe. And this was an important moment because Guadalupe, Guadalupe, Guadalupe. This was really important because this was a way of signaling to the native people of Mexico that Roman Catholicism was not merely a strange foreign religion that was kind of foisted on the indigenous people from the outside, but rather this was something that could be vouched for by indigenous people as well. You're going to read about other missionaries all over sort of North and South America. You're going to read about Marie de la Encarnacion, Marie of the Incarnation, who went to what is now Quebec and had a mission for young native girls there. You're going to read about Pedro Claver, Claver, who was a Jesuit who worked in what is now Colombia and who was a real advocate for the African slaves who were being imported to do a lot of the sort of backbreaking work of mining and so forth. There's missionary activity going on all over the Americas, almost exclusively Roman Catholic missions. And this brings me to a reason I think it's important to know this history and to know this particular chapter of this history, because it really helps us to understand the world today. Currently, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is Pope Francis, the very first Latin American Pope. He was from Argentina. And everyone, I think, sort of realized that it was only a matter of time before there was going to be a Latin American Pope, because over 40% of Roman Catholics in the world today come from Latin America. The two countries in the world today with the highest populations of Roman Catholics are Mexico and Brazil. So in many ways, Latin America is the heart of Roman Catholicism today. Now, of course, this is true, this is possible only because of the fact that the two major colonizing powers, European powers, in Latin America were Spain and Portugal. And these were two countries that were barely affected at all by the Protestant Reformation. These countries remained staunchly Catholic. We would live in a very different kind of world today if, say, England and Sweden had been the major colonizing powers in Central and South America. But of course, that's not what happened. So again, there's so many instances, so many examples of this. But if you want to understand the world that we live in today in 2018, you have to look at events that happened 500 years ago to help make sense of it. I do want to mention that this was a golden age, the 16th century, 17th century. These were a golden age of missionary activity. The missionary activity was not exclusively toward the West, toward what we call the New World, but there was quite a bit of missionary activity, mainly undertaken by Jesuits, to the East, to Asia, to places where the gospel had never been introduced before, or had not been introduced in a very long time. So there are Jesuit missionaries who go to places like Japan, have a great deal of success initially, and then face really bloody persecution. There was a movie that came out, I think it's on Amazon Prime right now, called Silence, a movie by the great filmmaker Martin Scorsese, and it tells the story of some of those Jesuit missionaries to Japan. There were similar endeavors in India, China as well. And one of the things that's interesting about these, again, almost exclusively Jesuit missionaries, is that they really made an attempt to adapt themselves to the local culture. They tried to dress like the local people. They learned the native languages, whether it was Japanese or Sanskrit in India. And so they really tried to present the gospel to the native peoples of Asia, not necessarily in a European form, but in a form that would make sense to these Asian cultures. And this is, of course, is something that missionaries even today have to struggle with. You know, if you're European or you're American and you're going to somewhere like Papua New Guinea, how do you present the gospel in a manner that will make sense in a culture very, very different from your own? All right, well, the last thing that I want to say, this is going to be a short video. The last thing I want to say is a bit about your primary source reading this week, a reading by Sor Juana. You can read her full name, which is impressive, along with other biographical information in this introductory sort of cover sheet, which is part of the PDF that you'll need to print out. So please be sure to read that. What I'm saying in this video is not a substitute for reading that introduction. So who is this Sor Juana, Sister Juana? Well, as the name suggests, she was a nun, and she's the very first American writer that we read in the entire humanities program. That alone makes her rather significant. She was born in 1651 near Mexico City in what was then New Spain. Mexico had been under Spanish rule for well over a century at this point. And Sor Juana was the illegitimate daughter. She was born out of wedlock. Her father was a Spanish man, and her mother was what was called a Criolla, C-R-I-O-L-L-A. That is a woman who was born in Mexico, but whose ancestry was Spanish rather than indigenous Mexican. Now, what we are reading this week are a couple of different things, really two different things. The longest reading by far is an excerpt from one of her letters. And the introduction will tell you a little bit about that. Let me just say a bit here. She was writing a letter defending herself. She was defending herself against a Mexican bishop who had published one of her works without her permission. She had written a letter to someone else that criticized a several decades old sermon by a Portuguese Jesuit. And so Sor Juana had written kind of a critique of that sermon. And again, without her permission, without her knowledge, this bishop disseminated her letter, and then, along with that, wrote a critique of Sor Juana's letter, but the bishop didn't write it under his own name. He wrote it under a pseudonym, a false name. He wrote it under the name Sor Filotea, Sister Filotea, as if he were another nun. Okay, so I know this is kind of confusing, but the main thing to understand here is that the bishop is publishing one of Sor Juana's writings without her permission, and along with that, publishing a critique under a false name of that very writing of Sor Juana. And the main point that the bishop made in the critique was that Sor Juana should focus less on sort of theological and scholarly matters, and she should just concentrate on the religious life, on being a good nun. So obviously, this puts Sor Juana on the defensive, and she feels like she needs to answer this charge in some ways. And so that's what she's doing in this letter that you are reading. And the main point that she's making, she makes other points along the way, but the main point that she's making is that women ought to be able to pursue both what we might call secular and also sacred studies. Okay, so this is not just about her in her mind. This is about women and what women ought to be allowed to do. And in the course of her defense, we learn a lot of interesting things about her education. So I think you'll be intrigued by that. So that's about like 85% of this week's reading. Then at the very end of the reading, at the very end of the PDF, there is a poem. Poem 92, a philosophical satire. So this is kind of disconnected in some ways from the letter. She was quite an accomplished poet, and one of the points of contact between the poem and the letter is that in the letter she defends poetry and the validity of writing things in poetry. Well, in case you haven't looked already, one of your discussion forum questions for the week is specifically on this poem, this philosophical satire. And the discussion forum question is twofold. What is the main point of the poem? What is she trying to say? What is she criticizing? And the second question is, do you think that her point has any relevance even in 21st century American life? So those are your questions. Now, I want you to work this out for yourself, but I'll give you a couple of things to look for. I will say that if you're looking for sort of the main gist of the poem, you can find it right there in the first stanza, the first 4 lines. Misguided men who will chastise a woman when no blame is due, oblivious that it is you who prompted what you criticize. Okay? So now you're going to have to read on if you want to know more details, but clearly this is going to be a critique of men who are hypocritical in some way, right? Because they're criticizing women for something. They're criticizing women for something that the men themselves are in some way responsible for. Now, that's vague. You're going to have to read the rest to fill in the details, but hopefully that will help you get started. And I will note 2 things about her own context that might shed a little bit of light on this poem. There is a parallel between her argument in this poem, because it is an argument, and the argument that she's making in her letter. In her letter, she is accusing her detractors of a kind of hypocrisy. As a woman, she was encouraged to write, and then she was criticized when she did write. Right? So there's that common theme of hypocrisy. And then let me also, and this is a clue as to what the poem is really about, let me mention again that she was born out of wedlock. I think that might possibly play in or have something to do with the main point that she wants to make here in this poem. Final note. I just want you to pay attention to the fact, and I believe this is mentioned in your introduction. Yes, it is. It's mentioned in the very last sentence of your introduction. She died very early in life, 1695. She was only, let's see, she was only in her 40s, mid-40s. She died ministering to plague victims. And I point that out because I think this suggests that she was a very morally and spiritually serious person. She was not someone who had entered the religious life just so that she could write and pursue scholarly aims, but that she took her religious vocation quite seriously as well. So I'll be interested in seeing what you think of her poem. That's all.